living along the Nile River, also building terraces and cultivating grain. At that time, Egypt was not what is today in terms of climate. Egypt was more like a savanna type of environment, grasslands with water holes and with a very rich animal life. And geographically, there was a continuum between northern um, Africa and the rest of the African continent. It is only around 6000 BC, due to climatic changes, that the Sahara Desert starts to emerge. So these grasslands that were very rich in flora and fauna and human inhabitants become a desert. And that huge desert creates a huge divide between the northern part of Africa and the rest of the continent. So Egypt gets locked into the cultural changes that are happening in the Middle East rather than what is going on in the rest of the African continent, even though they will have some connections to their neighbors to the south, and we'll talk about that later. So, who are these Egyptians, these early Egyptians? Most likely, they are the descendants of hunters and pastoralists who, as the Sahara Desert begins to grow, they move north, others move west, others move south, and eventually there's ones who will move east towards the Nile River and settle there, and they will adopt agricultural methods to provide for themselves. It is also believed that at one point, what you have is the invasion of people from the Asian continent. These people sometimes are called Hamites, uh, given the language that they spoke. The language that these people, the ancient Egyptians, spoke is a Hamitic language, and it is linked to, they're like cousins with the Semitic families of language. So whoever came from the Asiatic continent settle along the Nile River, they conquer or merge, it's not quite clear, with the peoples that already lived along the banks of the Nile. And it is that combination of these natives, these locals who had been there for many, many generations, and the newcomers that eventually form what we call Egypt today. And of course, by this time, what is happening is that the Sahara Desert has grown, and Egypt is basically a sliver of life in the midst of this arid desert. And you can see that in this satellite picture. The green area that snakes through the desert is really the Nile River, which overflows every year. And then after the waters recede, deposits very rich soil that can be used for agriculture. And then as the Nile River approaches the Mediterranean Sea, it forms a triangle. This is known as the delta of the Nile. So the population of Egypt is concentrated along the delta and along the banks of the river and along the Al Fayoum oasis that you see, which is that green spot next to the Nile River. This is an image of the river, actually from the river, on the banks. And as you can see the desert from there. So if you're standing on either side of the river Nile, the desert is right there within view. So what we're talking about is a relatively very narrow band of fertile land that goes along, and that along the delta with the delta is going to be actually quite fertile and will produce enough food not only to feed the population of Egypt, but for example in Roman times Egypt could feed probably about a third of the population of the Roman Empire. So the wealth of Egypt is this very fertile land. And actually the Egyptian name for Egypt is Kemet. Kemet means the black land or the black soil. Why? Because that silt that accumulates on top when the waters overflow, that black soil is life. That is fertile soil that will produce plenty of food for the Egyptians. As you advance south, you will begin to find the Nile cataracts. A cataract is a waterfall, and these waterfalls represent the natural limits of Egypt in ancient times. Eventually, the Egyptians will go beyond the cataracts and they will conquer additional territories. But as you reach the cataracts, you realize that you're entering into a new territory. You're coming close to what was called Nubia. Nubia was a country rich in some natural resources like gold and incense and other products, and it has a long relationship with the Egyptians. But the cataracts represented the physical limit of Egypt. A lot of what we know about Egypt comes from archaeology, from accounts of other civilizations, but also and mainly it is based on what they wrote. The Egyptians produced a system of writing called hieroglyphic writing. Probably around the year 3200 BC, you start to see the first evidence of hieroglyphic writing. It is different from cuneiform. Actually, cuneiform is the first, and then comes hieroglyphic writing, and there's no evidence that one was influenced by another. So they developed independently, and obviously the cuneiform of the Sumerians was first. So they produced hieroglyphics, but for centuries, no one could read them, because what happened is that at one point in Egyptian history, the Egyptians are conquered by the well, first of all, they're Christianized, and that broke a lot of the links to the old culture, which was linked to the pagan religion of the Egyptians. Then Egypt was conquered by the Arab Muslims. So not only was the religion of the Muslims imposed upon the population, but also the language. So Egyptians became speakers of Arabic. So by the early Middle Ages, there was no one who spoke the language, and obviously there was no one who could interpret the symbols. So a key to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphic system and our window into their minds is something called the Rosetta Stone. In 1898, Napoleon, the great emperor, at that time he was only a general, he invaded Egypt with his French troops. And during his occupation of Egypt, he brought in a group of scientists, a group of scholars who were interested in Egyptian antiquities. So they started to dig in several places, and they found at a place called Rosetta this stone. Eventually, the French army had to surrender to the British, so the British took everything that the French had discovered, and now the Rosetta Stone is at the British Museum in London. This artifact is one of the most important archaeological artifacts in history. Why? Because if you notice, there are three sections of writing. One is hieroglyphs, and those are the ones that probably you have seen before. They look like little figures. Usually those are the ones that you see decorating the tombs of pharaohs or in cartouches that people wear on their necks. The next section is actually something called demotic, and demotic is like a shorthand for hieroglyphic. It's the kind of writing that the Egyptians use when taking notes on a clay tablet. The hieroglyphics, the fancy ones, are the ones that you use in temples and in monuments. And then the third section is written in Greek. Why Greek? Well, Alexander the Great, the king of Macedonia, conquered Egypt, and after his death, one of his generals, Ptolemy, installed a Macedonian dynasty. The Macedonians spoke Greek, and eventually the dominant, the ruling class of the Egyptians become these Greek people, and they bring in their Hellenic and their Hellenistic civilization to Egypt. So for about 300 years, the Egyptians are ruled by a Macedonian dynasty, and when they issue important documents, when they issue edicts, proclamations, they want them to, they obviously want the people who speak and read Greek to know them, but also in deference to the place where they are, they use Egyptian hieroglyphs, and for practical purposes, they use demotic, which is the common type of writing that is used. So in this stone, you have an edict from a king called Ptolemy. Actually, all the kings of Egypt were called Ptolemy. But this particular one produces this document. And what is important is not so much the content of the message, but the system in which it's written. Because when this was discovered, every scholar knew that that was the key to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs. Many people are working on deciphering the Rosetta Stone, but it will be a Frenchman by the name of Jean-François Champollion who will decipher the system. And what he understood is that Egyptian hieroglyphs are not letters. In our alphabet, each letter represents a sound. That's not the case with hieroglyphic systems. In hieroglyphic systems, some symbols are sounds, some symbols are letters, some symbols are grammatical concepts. It's a highly complex system. The hieroglyphic system contains about 1,100 symbols. So Jean-François Champollion figured that out. That is not a one-to-one equivalent to the letters of the alphabet. He also understood something else, and he's not the first one to understand that, but other people were on the same path. Even though Egyptian was no longer spoken in Egypt in the early 1800s, there is a group of Egyptians, even today, who are Christian. They're called Coptic Christians. I think there are about 8 million of them today in Egypt. They're a minority, but a substantial minority. These Coptic Egyptians spoke Arabic, and culturally they're not different from the rest of their Muslim brothers. However, in church, when they go to Mass, the Mass and all religious ceremonies are performed in Coptic. And what is Coptic? Coptic is a language that is derived from ancient Egyptian. So the relationship between Coptic and ancient Egyptian language is the same as, let's say, Italian and Latin, or Spanish and Latin, or French and Latin. Latin was the original language of the Roman Empire, and out of that came these other languages, right? French, Portuguese, Italian, Spanish, Romanian. If you understand that, then you can figure out that from Coptic, you can work your way backwards to Egyptian. And that's what Jean-François Champollion did. He figured out the code. He figured out that by looking at contemporary Coptic language, they could decipher the language of the ancient Egyptians. And of course, this is an incredible, difficult thing because he didn't just decipher the whole thing. After Champollion, it took a lot of work because the history of Egypt is thousands of years old. So the Egyptian language that was spoken by the Egyptians in the year 3000 BC is obviously different from the Egyptian language spoken in the year 2000 BC and 1000 BC. So you can imagine the complexity of being able to read and decipher these different versions of the language. But thanks to the Rosetta Stone, historians can go to the temples, to the tombs, and read all of this history, all of these messages, all of these religion that is basically carved in stone. And the Egyptians can now tell us their own story, their own history. Egypt has obviously a very long history. So here you can see a periodization of the history of ancient Egypt. So basically from around the year 4000 on, you have the Nile culture developing. You see already some of the elements of Egyptian religion, Egyptian social structure, some agricultural technological innovations. Then you have the Archaic period, which is the period in which Egypt becomes unified, followed by the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is easy to remember because it's the time of the pyramids. This is when they built those incredible monuments. And then you have the Middle Kingdom, which is when they abandon the construction of pyramids and the rulers dedicate their wealth more to projects that benefit the population rather than just spending their wealth and effort on these gigantic tombs. And then we have the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom is the imperial era of Egypt. This is when the Egyptians go out of their borders and conquer foreign lands. And the New Kingdom ends around the year 1000 with the crisis of the first millennium. I have mentioned that before. This is when the Sea Peoples appear and cause the collapse of the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. And then it is followed by a period where the Egyptians will be ruled by Libyan kings or Nubian kings. They will be invaded by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians, by the Persians. And finally, you have the Greek or Ptolemaic era. This is after Alexander conquers them. And finally, when they become incorporated into the Roman Empire. And in between these periods, there are a lot of intermediate periods. So the history of Egypt is very, very vast. So we're not only going to concentrate on certain aspects to get a sense of what this civilization was about. We're not going to go through all of these periods. So we're going to start with the settlement of Egypt. Um, Probably around 5000 BC, and of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about dates here. There are these invasions, most likely from people who lived in what today would be the Sinai Peninsula or in the area of Syria, Palestine, definitely Asiatic peoples who arrive and settle along the delta and along the banks of the Nile River. Of course, there were people already living there. Remember that I mentioned that pastoralists and hunter-gatherers and farmers had already moved towards the Nile because water disappeared from the rest of North Africa. So when these people arrive, they settle there, and that means that they probably conquered these people. So it was probably an act of conquest. But we don't have much information about that. What we know is that they spoke a different language, and that eventually became the language of the ancient Egyptians. This language belongs to a family of languages called Hamitic, and those languages are still spoken in parts of North Africa, in Sudan, and Ethiopia, and I believe in Somalia. These languages have some connection to Semitic languages, and they are probably from Asiatic origins. And that's why we call these invasions the Hamite invasions. Who are these Hamite people? We don't really know. It is only basically we think that based on linguistic evidence, there must have been some sort of invasion around this time, 5000, perhaps 4000 BC. So the people that we call the Egyptians are a blend of the people who were already living there and these new invaders. And as you can see in these dots and these little lines, the invaders created these principalities along the Nile River. So here you can see how they settled in the lower part of Egypt, which is along the delta that is close to the sea, and then upper Egypt, which is upriver, which is the lower part of your screen. And each one of those lines represents a segment of territory, a segment of river that was probably ruled by a different lord. These principalities are called nomes, Nomes. So a nome is one of the early states, if you wish, of Egypt. And each nome was ruled by a nomarch. By the year 3000 BC, the little nomes have coalesced into two big kingdoms. The kingdom of Upper Egypt, which is in the lower part of the map, it's called Upper because it's upriver, and then the kingdom of Lower Egypt, which is located closer to the sea in the upper side of the map, along the delta. The delta is that triangular shape that you see there in green. There were attempts to unify the two kingdoms, but the person who was successful was a king by the name of Narmer. Sometimes he's also called Menes, and there's some confusion as to whether Narmer or Menes and Menes are the same person. Traditional history puts them together. They believe that Narmer and Menes are one and the same, and traditionally we say that he is the person who unified Lower and Upper Egypt. What you see here is not just a decorative object, it is a historical document, a very important one. It's called the Narmer palette. A palette is an object that in those days Egyptians used to mix makeup. And that makeup was probably connected to some type of ceremonial function, some ritual. It is a document because it tells a story. And on the left, you see Narmer wearing this cone, which is really the crown of Upper Egypt. It was called the White Crown of Upper Egypt. And he has a mace, a weapon, and he's about to execute someone who's on the ground. That person is most likely the king of Lower Egypt. And on top of that, you see the image of Horus. The god Horus is one of the most important gods. And under Narmer, you can see that he is trampling his enemies. So obviously, this is a scene that evokes the conquest of Upper Egypt. Of Lower Egypt by Upper Egypt. And then on the next side, on the other side of the palette, what you see is Narmer parading, wearing not the white crown of Upper Egypt, but the red crown of Lower Egypt. And you know who Narmer is because he's taller than everyone else, and his soldiers are carrying standards. And then in front of them, maybe you cannot make out the image, but you can see that on the right side, and the upper part, there are all of these bodies without heads. Those are the enemies of Narmer. And then below, what do you see? Two lions that are basically crossing their necks into one. And of course, that is the symbol of the unification of the two Egyptian kingdoms. So from around 3000 on, Egypt is a single country ruled by one king. In this frame, what you see is a type of structure known as a mastaba. The term mastaba is Arabic for bench, because if you are walking on the desert and you see that from a distance, it looks like a bench, but it's really a massive monument. It's a tomb. And it is an early form of tombs that developed during the Old Kingdom after Egypt became unified. As you can see, the tomb is built on the surface, but basically it has just narrow passages, and then underground there are two chambers, one to bury the king and one to bury the queen. Why is this so important? Well, right there in that building, you see the graphic illustration of one of the most important political and religious concepts in ancient Egypt. Why go through the trouble of elaborating this very large tomb filled with treasures? Of course, tombs exist in every civilization, and powerful people want to be remembered with big monuments, but this is different, because this is a representation of what we call the royal doctrine. According to Egyptian belief, when the king is alive, he is the living incarnation of the god Horus. Horus is a god who appears in the form of a human but has the head of a falcon, and sometimes he appears with a patch on one of his eyes because he had a fight with his uncle and he lost one of his eyes in that fight. So the king is a living god. He doesn't rule in the name of God like the Mesopotamian kings. He doesn't get his authority from a god. He is a god. He is the embodiment of Horus. When the king dies, he doesn't really die. He's making a transition to the afterlife, the underworld. And the belief, according to the royal doctrine, is that when the king passes on to the next life, he will then become Osiris. And Osiris is another important god in the Egyptian pantheon. Osiris is part of some of the early mythological stories about the creation of Egypt. He, at one point, according to the beliefs, ruled over the Egyptians, and after being killed, he was resurrected by Amen-Ra, the father of the gods and creator of the universe, and he now rules over the underworld. And what is very important about this is that every time that a king dies and goes to the underworld, it fuses with Osiris and strengthens him. And that process of the king dying and then integrating himself into Osiris, that represents the harmony of the universe, the health of the universe, if you wish. This concept is known as Ma'at. Ma'at means balance, it means harmony, it means equilibrium. Egyptians believed that when Amen-Ra, the father of the gods, created the universe, everything had a place, everything had a reason. Everything was pure balance, harmony, perfection. And that had to be expressed in the seasons, in the patterns of the wind, in the patterns of the river Nile, in the cycles of agriculture, of birth, death, and rebirth. Uh, Ma'at had to be expressed in the structure of society, in the structure of government, in art, in architecture. And Ma'at is delicate. It can only exist if that transition of the king from this world to the underworld happens smoothly. And for that transition to take place, the king's body has to be preserved, and thus the process of mummification. Now, mummification is common to many cultures, and historians believe that mummification started in North Africa by accident. It's not only in Egypt, but in North Africa. What happens is that people probably were buried in caves, or they were buried in certain places, and because of the dryness of the desert, they mummified naturally. And this may have given the Egyptians the idea that if you do other things to the body, that mummification might take place even better than if you just leave the body in a dry place. So they started a practice where they would take out the organs of the dead king. They would drain all the fluids, all the liquids from his body, and would treat the body with natural substances. The body will then be wrapped in linen and preserved for posterity. The idea is that the king needs that body in order to make that trip into the underworld and fuse with Osiris. The royal doctrine is quite unique because it establishes that the king is God. The only other civilization where I can think of something similar happening is the civilization of the ancient Incas of Peru, where the Inca, or the emperor, was considered a living god. Other civilizations usually say the king or the emperor rules in the name of the god. The Romans called their emperor God, but for political reasons. If you were a Roman citizen, you didn't have to consider him a god, but if you were just a subject of the empire, you had to acknowledge the divinity of Caesar, of the emperor. But that's not really believing that he is a god, right? In the case of the ancient civilizations of Mesoamerica, like the Mayans, for example, the kings had a very important religious role. And in some situations, in some civilizations, it was believed that a king would become a god after he died. But a living god, that's something very different. And that's what makes this institution of kingship, of monarchy in Egypt quite peculiar. Here we see the first pyramid. Now, previously we saw a mastaba, but a mastaba didn't seem to be enough to glorify the power of this living God. So, under the reign of King Sosir, this was built, which is basically a mastaba, and they built another mastaba on top, another one on top, and another one on top. It looks like a cake, right? And it's layers, and it's built with bricks. It is massive. You look at the people in the picture and you can get a sense of the proportions of this. But what the king is saying is that this process of preserving the body of the king is so important that it has to be immortalized in a big monument. And within a few generations, they go from a mastaba to the steps pyramid located at Saqqara to the following. These are the great pyramids of Giza, and in particular the middle one is the Great Pyramid of Khufu. It's an amazing feat of engineering. It's pure perfection in the way it was built, and it reflects the incredible power of the kings of the Old Kingdom. Now, if you look at this image, today, these pyramids are very close to the city of Cairo. Cairo has grown tremendously. And if you look farther back, you can see the Nile River. The blocks of limestone with which the pyramids were built were carved many, many, many miles uh, up the river. So that meant that they had to be quarried, put on barges, then taken to the river, and look at that distance. Those gigantic blocks had to be dragged from the uh, edge of the river all the way in the back to the place of construction. And what is interesting about these types of monuments is that there is a sense of urgency when you build them. When you become king, the first order of business is building a pyramid. Why? Because you don't know how long you're going to live. And you don't want to die before your pyramid is finished. Now, in the case of the Great Pyramid, it was built over the course of 20 years and probably by a crew of 30,000 men working night and day. It is important to note that the people who built this pyramid are Egyptian workers who are free. The pyramids were not built by slaves. The pyramids were not built by the Hebrews like they show in those, movies about the Ten Commandments. No. The pyramids were a collective effort to create a monument that would preserve Ma'at, M-A-A-T, something that would preserve the harmony of the universe. And that means that the people engaged in this were professional builders. And we know that because in the vicinity of the pyramids, archaeologists have found evidence of the places where the workers used to live. They lived there for a generation, basically. And we know that inside the pyramid, some of them even carved graffiti saying, this section was built by the crew of so-and-so, showing pride in what they were doing, because what they were doing was helping preserve the harmony of the universe. The pyramids are a testament to the incredible power of the kings of the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom comes to an end, and after an intermediate period, the Middle Kingdom emerges. We're not going to enter into much detail about the Middle Kingdom, except that during this time, the rulers of Egypt abandoned the construction of pyramids. It was a tremendous effort. It took a long time. It took a tremendous amount of manpower, a tremendous amount of resources. So pyramid building is abandoned. And of course, the kings are still buried in very luxurious tombs with a lot of treasures, but it doesn't represent the same type of effort, the massive effort that is required to build a pyramid. And from the descriptions that we read and from things that people write under tombs, we get the sense that this is a happy time where the rulers spend a lot of the wealth of Egypt in building temples, in building granaries, in improving the irrigation networks so that there's more food. So it seems that it's a very prosperous time. Also, during this time, you see that the Egyptians begin to advance south, and they are getting closer and closer to Nubia, which is the country to the south. The Nubians were an ancient people, neighbors to the Egyptians. That would be modern day Sudan. And Nubia is important because it has a lot of natural resources of great value, mainly gold and incense. Incense is a sap that comes from some trees that only grow in probably what today would be Somalia, Ethiopia, or Southern Arabia. And incense was used not only in perfumes and cosmetic goods, but it was burned in religious ceremonies. And the belief that was that when you smell the incense, you're smelling the essence of a god. So by conquering this section and by getting closer to Nubia, the Egyptians are trying to have control over resources that are going to be very valuable to them and that are going to be one of the foundations of their wealth. The Middle Kingdom comes to an end due to invasions. And this is a period that is not yet well understood by historians. Around 1560, the king Seqenenre-Tao, who ruled in Upper Egypt, attempts to expel the Hyksos from his country. And from what you see in this picture, it didn't go well. This is the mummy of second Enre-Tau, and if you look at his head, he was brutally killed in battle, and that huge hole that you see, that's an axe right there going through, and of course there's not only one. You can see that he's hacked on several places. He is going to be succeeded by Kamose, his son. And Kamose is pretty successful. He advances north with a large army. He lays siege to the city of Avaris, which was the capital of the Hyksos. But then we don't know much about him, so we assume that he also got killed in the process. So it will be up to Ahmose the first. Ahmose is the brother of Kamose. He ascends to the throne after his father and his brother are killed, and he will make sure that this time his campaign against the Hyksos is successful.